Welcome back, everyone. In the last lesson, we learned how to use GraphQL to pull in our Markdown files and then use them and their data to populate out this list of our blogs. Now, we're only displaying the excerpts, so we're not actually explaining the body of our blogs. We're going to do that in an individual blog page. And the way we're going to do that is we're actually going to need to leverage this new concept where what we're going to do is hijack the build step whenever we built out our Gatsby blog, when we ran Yarn Develop for the first time. We are going to come in here when it creates those nodes, which represent the files that we've written in the first place, and we're going to grab the Markdown and we're going to build out each individual page at that moment. In order for us to do this, we actually need to modify our node Gatsby file. So in here, you'll see that there's this Gatsby node.js. In this file, this is code that will run theoretically on the node server that represents the Gatsby framework. Now, two things to note here. The first is that the code that we're going to write is not React code. So it might not be something you recognize if you are only used to writing React. There's a little bit of backend node code here that we're writing, but it's not completely Node either because it has to do with the Node API inside of Gatsby. So you can easily take a look at the documentation here if you follow this link inside of your Gatsby Node.js. But let's just get started, because once we actually write this code, I'm certain you'll at least be able to follow along with what's happening because it is JavaScript. So let's just get rid of this. And what we're going to say is exports.onCreateNode. So Gatsby is expecting that if you export this method onCreateNode, it is equal to a function, and they're going to pass this function a bunch of properties, one of them being the node itself whenever it's creating the node. Now, as you remember when we did our GraphQL query for our files, each file had a node, which was a representation of that file. So what we're going to do is we're just going to simply console.log that node object. There's a property on there called internal, which just represents data about the actual node itself, and we want the type. So now, if we refresh our server, what we're going to see is when it's building, we see this list of all of these different things that we're logging out. Now, these are all the types of node that we have available. And the main ones that we want are the Markdown remarks, because as you remember, the Markdown files is what we want to use to build out our pages. So what we're going to say is we're going to say if the node.internal.type is equal to Markdown remark, then what we're going to do is we are actually going to create this thing called a slug. A slug inside of Gatsby is the URL or the link that the browser is able to access from our application in order to navigate to the page required. Now we have to dynamically build out the slug and attach it to the node as a field, because we want to access that field inside of our application so that whenever we try to route to it or link to it, we are always pathing to the correct path. So we want to build that path out dynamically. We actually get access inside of this onCreateNode function, this other property called actions. And these are actions that we will receive from Gatsby. The one that we want to pluck off is this action called createNodeField. CreateNodeField is exactly as it sounds. We want to add a new field to our node. So we want to destructure this off of our actions. And what we're going to do is build the field path to our node. This field path is what we're going to be using inside of our application to navigate to this page. Now, the only thing to keep in mind is that inside of Gatsby, this thing is called a slug. And a slug is essentially just some kind of file path or navigation path inside of the application that allows us to route to it. We actually get access to this function that we get from Gatsby source file system. Gatsby source file system, as you remember, was this plugin that we used to actually get access to our files in the first place. So in order to bring it in, we are going to destructure off create file path from this Gatsby source file system. You'll see here that I use backticks. Now, backticks is actually what Gatsby prefers you to use when instantiating strings. In fact, we should probably change our markdown remark over to using backticks as well. And this is simply due to the prettier configuration rules that are set with Gatsby when we loaded it by default. Now you can actually find these rules inside of this prettier RC file in your base root folder. And prettier, if you're not sure what that is pretty much just a tool that allows you to consistently enforce certain typings and stylings regarding the way that you write code. Prettier is really great if you have an application with many developers that have different ways that they like to write things. With Prettier, whenever you save or whenever you actually type anything, you might get warnings telling you that you cannot do certain things. So for example, if I ever try to make this a single string, whenever I save Prettier, we'll force that to be double quotes. So if we switch over to using backticks, that's perfectly fine too. You'll actually find that when you look through your Gatsby files, any file that gets generated by Gatsby is using backticks. So it doesn't hurt, it doesn't actually impact performance in any way. So let's just switch over to backticks. But now that we have our create file path function from Gatsby source file system, what we want to do is we actually want to generate that new slug. Now the slug itself, as I mentioned, was the route. Now the route, we're going to use our create file path method. And what this create file path method takes is an object as the argument. The first thing it takes is a node as the first property. The node property essentially just points to the actual node that we're trying to convert into a file path. So as you saw with our pages, what Gatsby does under the hood is it takes the name of the actual file and it turns it into the literal name of the route to that page as well. So if it's page-2 as the file name, the actual route to the URL is also page-2. So we're going to pass it the node. We're also going to pass it the method that it needs to fetch the node. Now this is pretty much in the API docs and you just have to follow along. What it does is you have to get this get node function that we also get from onCreateNode. And we're going to pass that as the second argument. Get node is just a function that allows you to pull the actual node object representation of a file or an edge. Now you remember when we looked at our actual GraphQL, we saw that we had nodes, right? And then we have these edges. Get node is just a way to get this literal node object. It just uses it under the hood to actually get the required node that it wants. Third field is an optional field, which is called base path. And base path is something that you add when you want to add a base path to the URL. In our case, there's no need for it. So we can just ignore that property and just pass this in as our slug. Now we're finally going to actually create the node field on our node. So what we're going to do is just call create node field. And we're going to pass this an object where the first property is the node pointing to the same node. We're also going to put the name. So this is the name of the property that we want to add. And we want to add it called slug. And the value is going to be the slug itself that we just created using create file path. So with this, whenever we actually end up creating all of our nodes, we will end up appending onto that node a new slug property with the value of our string. So now if we actually restart our server and we check out our GraphQL once this is finished, we'll be able to see it on all of our markdown nodes, that new field that we added. So let's just let this finish building. Okay, now if we refresh, you'll see on this node that there's this new thing called fields. And in fields is slug, which is our new property that we just added. So any field that you add to a node goes under this fields property. And now if we refetch, we'll see inside of our slug, we have the actual route that we need to use to navigate to the actual route path that we declared. Now what we have to do is actually build the pages dynamically, because now that we've set up our node, we have to actually set up the actual page that we build. So we'll do that in the next lesson.